Welcome to A Shadow in the Dark. What are shadow cubes? My name is Glenn Schwartzberg with Interrel Consulting, and this is a reprise of the session that I gave at Kscope 21 a month ago, somewhere around there. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been doing Essbase since about 1992. I'm an Oracle ACE director, which basically means I get to evangelize the products, and I have worked with development a lot on the different versions of Essbase, especially the cloud versions. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop my video to save a little bit of bandwidth, and we'll see how well this all works. So welcome to A Shadow in the Dark. What are shadow cubes? Of course, we have to have the obligatory slide about Argano Interrel, and this will be the world's quickest sales pitch that a lot of very bright companies have come together, world-class firms, to create Argano, and we are now Argano Interrel, which basically deals with the EPM or Enterprise Performance Management piece of the world, but we now can be a full service vendor for companies to do not just EPM and Essbase and BI, but also to do other things like supply management and human capital management and sales enablement. If you want to learn more about Argano, please go to argano.com and you can find out about it. Okay, I just love that introduction. So to me, it's all about time. How long does it take to update your outline? How long does it take to run your batch processes? Do you require 24/7 uptime for your cubes? In the old world, on-prem world, you could create manual processes to swap cubes out, and many companies actually implemented a strategy like that. But moving to the cloud brought new issues. Problems with having to reassign security every time that you do the swap. In OAC, you didn't have access to the server to do the swapping. In 19C and 21C, you have encryption at rest, so you can't move items between directories because it's based on the directory that they're in. Being afraid that with every new version that came out, something would break in your manual process that you would have to go back and try and redesign. I do have a customer that did implement a cube swapping process before this came out in OAC Essbase, but it took 14 steps, multiple REST API calls, and intensive file manipulation to be able to get what they wanted to do. So really, is the future here? Well, just suppose you had the ability to clone your cubes while allowing the users to use your production cubes and while you're doing your updates in the background. Then when you're done with your updates, you can replace the production cube with the background cube. Even more, you could have a select group of users have access to that background cube in order to validate that everything is good before you promote it back into production. How about not having to need to worry about reassigning security, taking off security on your background cube, or reassigning it once you try and do the cube swap? It's all handled automatically. No need to get on the server to move artifacts around, no time delays, no real downtime. There's a very slight amount, but very little. Built-in functionality for things that you had to do manually before. this all sounds great and wonderful, but where can I do this? Well, there's two places that you can do it. You can do it on Essbase 21C, and the two places are you can do it on an Essbase independent install, which means the customer data center, whether that customer data center is on-prem or is in some third-party data center, or if it's in the cloud somewhere. But if you are doing it on the cloud and it is Oracle, you're going to want to do it on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, OCI, in the marketplace. And the advantage of the marketplace install is that it's got a pre-built installer for you, and there are some features and functionality that are not available in the independent or the customer data center install that will only ever be cloud. That's a whole different discussion. We're not going to get into that today. So my question is, why would I want to do this? You know, why is this better than the manual process, the way that people have been doing it for years? Well, there's multiple reasons. One of them I've already mentioned, that the maintenance of security is removed. Users will have access, and I'm going to call it the public cube, the main cube, will have access to that public cube without having to reassign security that you had to do in that normal cube swap. You don't have to take the security off the old cube and move it to the new one. It will be there with the new one. I mean, with the public cube always. With OCI, items are encrypted at rest. So swapping items out the way we used to do it won't work anymore. In order to do a manual cube swap, you have to have access to the server. And while with 21C, you do have access to the server, but most organizations are trying to limit that access, or frankly, remove it completely. They don't want you to get on the servers if you don't have to, because there's always the possibility that you mess something up. And also remember that when the Shadow Cube project was started, customers were on OAC Essbase, and they had no access to the server whatsoever. And so when the project was first started and I was helping development along with the Gap, you might recognize that retailer name, we had a lot of requirements to be able to do this process without being on the server. So they listened to us and they made it what I think is a pretty good process. And the final thing is that one of the requirements for the Gap and for most other clients is that you have to have partitions that remain intact. And what was happening with their manual cube swap processes is that it would take a long time to rebuild partitions. So by putting this all together, you could have it done without it impacting the partitions. The partitions would remain in place and would work, I'll say almost instantaneously. So what is the process for using this shadow queue process? Well, first of all, it requires using REST API calls. And we'll get into that in just a minute. I'll show you exactly how we'll do it. But there's really 3 steps to the shadow process. The first one is creating a shadow copy. And what you're going to do with this step is you're actually going to create a copy of the application, not the database, but the application, into a background copy of that application. Then on that background process, you're going to do all of your work. And what I should mention is when you create that shadow copy, it takes your original cube, the cube I call the public cube, and I got that phrase from George Cooper from the Gap, so I'll give him credit. But when you put that public cube, when you create the shadow, that public cube is actually stopped and restarted for a second. And what it does is it puts that cube into a read-only mode. And that makes sense because you don't want people to be able to update that cube while you're working on the background copy. So then the second part of that is you're going to do your processing on that shadow cube, that background cube. And it doesn't, it doesn't matter what it is. That process could be doing an outline restructure that takes a long time, or it could be running your calc scripts and your load processes. And so all of that work is being done on the shadow version of the cube while people are still accessing the public version of the cube. Then the last step is you have a decision to make. If you find that after you've done all of that work on your shadow cube, that there's a problem, maybe that you have a problem with the process and you didn't load all of the data properly, or it doesn't tie out, or whatever it is that you're determining you're not going to promote it back, you can delete that shadow copy. And by deleting it, it puts the original cube back into read-write mode, assuming that's what the security allows people to do on it. The second thing that you could do is you could promote that cube that you had in the background that you've done all of that great processing on, and you put it back into being the public cube. Now, in both of those cases, the shadow cube itself gets renamed to be the primary cube. So when that happens, the cube actually has to stop, both of them, in order for that copy to occur, but that only takes a few seconds. So instead of spending 30 minutes or 3 hours of downtime while your batch process is running, you've basically had the cube down for 30 to 60 seconds. Now, what happens once the shadow cube is promoted or deleted, that background cube is deleted and the original security on the public cube is still in place. Partitions are in place and everything else works just hunky-dory. So there is a question about stopping and starting the public cube when creating the shadow cube, and that is, will that kill any connection on the public cube that users would need to reconnect? And the answer is potentially yes. There's actually some settings in the shadow copy and on the promote to what happens with active sessions. So there's an amount of time that you can wait for those sessions to end before it does the promotion. If nobody is actively retrieving data when you want to do these things, there's no downtime, and you don't need, in any case, you don't need to reconnect. It will just kill if you tell it to, it will kill the connection that's going on, but the connection to the application is still there. And so refreshing the data once the shadow copy or promotion is done, they can just retrieve the data. So in that very short window, there is a slight amount of downtime. And in a minute, I'll show you all of the commands and how to do the REST calls and all of that. So there are a couple of warnings that I'm going to have to give you. And this actually caused me some grief early on. Commands are case sensitive. So in the case of one of the commands, it's a true or false, and it has to be lowercase. The first time I tried doing this, I typed it in with a capital T and I couldn't figure out why my command wasn't working. When you create the shadow cube, you can't do things like rename the application or the database name in between. the names have to remain the same because it's going to be copying the application back to where it was before. So don't rename your database in between. Don't rename the application. They've got to be the same. Unless explicitly defined, only administrators are going to have access to the shadow cubes. So the users who are on the public cube won't see the shadow cube. You can, in your process, explicitly assign security to the shadow cube for certain users to be able to see it and test it out. But when you say that you gave somebody full read access on the shadow cube, but on the public cube, they only have read access to certain scenarios. When you give them access back to the public cube, that access that you explicitly gave them on the shadow cube is dropped. They're sorry, going through puberty again, is dropped, and you only have the access you had on the original cube. And vice versa, you could give limited access on the shadow cube, but they might have more access on the public cube. So we're going to go ahead and do a live demo. I like to live dangerously. And so we'll see what happens with this. So I'm going to stop my slide presentation. And hopefully you can see my screen, and you're going to see. And remember, I said that this is a repeat of my Kscope 21 session. So I'm going to be using my Kscope 21 cube. Now, I mentioned that the only way to do these is through REST API calls. And one of the really nice things that Oracle has done for us is they've given us the ability to actually see those REST calls. So I'm logged in. I hopefully am logged onto my server still. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to duplicate this tab because I want to. And so here's my duplicated tab. If I come in here and I back up here to where it says jet, and I remove that, and I type in rest/doc, and this will work with the independent install or the cloud version. I'm on the cloud version, but it works just as well for 21C independent. And what you actually get is you get all of the REST calls that Oracle uses in order to create the system and do all of the work on the system. So I'm going to scroll down here to applications because I know that's where it is. And down here somewhere, I have a whole bunch of commands like create shadow. And if I click on this, and I'm going to move it up a little bit, what I get and what I love is Oracle has started on the new REST API calls, putting all of the information you need about this in here. It tells you what it does and how you can do it. And then it actually gives you all of the different commands and what they mean. So up here, it talks about what they mean, like wait for ongoing updates in seconds. So this will wait for a minute before initiating the clone process. So that's part of the question that somebody asked about what, if it's going to knock people off. Well, if it's doing stuff, then you can set up a wait. And in here, I actually could do a try it out. And if I do this, I can fill in the parameters and execute it, and it will run. So if I really wanted to test it, I could do it straight from here. Now, we're not going to do that in a production environment. So I was just showing you that, here it is. Here is I think it's before it, is the delete shadow. And in here, I only need the name of the shadow cube. And the third one I'm going to use is this promote. And so it has some parameters in here as well. And we'll get into all of these in just a minute. But I wanted to do this almost like I would do it in a real environment. So I have a Windows box here, my PC actually. And what I did is I created a batch file that's going to do my process. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set some environment variables and things like where my directories are. I have a Maxell script that I'm using, encrypted IDs and password. I have a server name and all of that. So the first thing I do is I bring all of that in here. I change directories to my Maxell directory because I'm going to run Maxell in just a little bit. And then I'm going to run a PowerShell command. And I'm going to show you these commands in just a minute. And so what I'm going to do here is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my shadow. And I'm going to tell it that I want to do it on this application and that I want to run this in background. Then after I do this, and I've got pauses in here, I obviously wouldn't do this in a real environment because I don't want my process to stop. But when I'm showing you things, I want it to stop so I can show you what it looks like. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call a Maxell script. And in a minute, I'll show you what that actually does. And then I'm going to call another PowerShell script. And then this time I'm going to promote the application. So let's go ahead and take a look at my PowerShell script on how I put this together. So I have a bunch of parameters in here, switches on what it is that I'm going to do. And this is a very simplistic PowerShell script. And if you actually want my samples, send me an email either at gschwartzberg@interrel.com or info@interrel.com, and I'll send you all of the scripts that I was using to do this against Sample Basic. So then the first thing that I have to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get that all of my variables right here that I'm just going to bring in that my variables for running all of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to encrypt my ID and my password. And then I'm going to log on to the server using a REST API call. And that's what this session is going to do right here. And if I have a problem, I'm going to write some statuses and I'm going to get out. Now, if I want to create that shadow, I'm going to, I'm going to set this to true, which is what my first statement does. And then I have a whole bunch of things that I'm passing to it, what I've called the payload or the body of the statement. So I'm going to pass in what my application name is. And in this case, I'm going to create the shadow cube with a prefix of underscore in process underscore and my original application name. Now, I have the ability to hide the shadow. And if I hide the shadow, it means that it doesn't show up in EAS or in the web interface or anywhere else. So I'm going, in this case, I'm setting this to false because I want to show you that the cube actually exists. And if I were going to have some users who were going to validate it, I would want them to be able to do that as well. I have the wait time for updates in seconds. And if we look up here, I think I've set it to 0 as the default, but I could have overridden that and set it. And because I don't have anyone else really on this server, 0 is just fine. And then if I want to run it in background, if I wanted to create a job in the Essbase interface, then I set this to true, and I am. If I wanted to do it interactively here, then I would set it to false. And so just like in the REST REST sample that I showed you in Swagger, here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to look for a response. I'm going to invoke my REST method, and I'm going to do a shadow copy, passing all of this information, and I'm going to pass it into my headers pass in my headers, which is my login information. And if I run into a problem, I'm going to write some statuses and I'm going to get out. So let's see if this actually even works. Cross your fingers, this is live. So I have this directory here that has my batch file in it. And so if I run this, it should run. Oh, before I do that, just one thing to show you that I'm not cheating. So if I look at the sheet information for this particular cube that I've got up here, this is my Kscope 21 application on my Essbase demo server. Let's see if I'm still connected. And it's restarting the application. So I am connected. And what I'm going to show you is I could come in here, and I've done this before. Oops, let's do this, 888. And I can submit data. And so just to prove it, delete that, refresh, and you can see that my data has changed. No big deal. That's what I should be able to do. So now I'm going to come over here and I'm going, oh, and if we come back to the applications and I refresh this, all we're seeing is Kscope 21. So now if I run my shadow cube.bat, I'm just going to double click on it and bring this over here. So what you can see is it ran that statement and I got this nice shadow cube created message from my batch file. It created a job. It created job 380 and it told me what it was doing. So now if I come back here to jobs, I should see a job 380 right here. And I'm using this test user ID. I'm not using my own ID. And it's ID 380 and you can see that it completed. If I come back over here to applications, I'm going to have to change this to be Kscope again. And now I get an in progress Kscope 21 and I get Kscope 21. So if I go back to my Excel now, what happened here? If I try to change numbers now and submit data, I get this nice message that says the administrator is temporarily disabled update commands. So it's telling the users, hey, we're updating the cube in the background. You can't do any updates. So all well and good. That's exactly what we would expect it to do. Now for the next step, let me go back here to my web UI and I'm going to open up this original outline right here and come up here to outline. And what we're going to be doing in this process is we're going to be adding members into the product dimension. So right now the product dimension has 5 children, you know, colas, root beers, cream sodas, fruit drinks, diet. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to add in to this oh, I need to add one more file up here. Hang on a second. Let's go to my files and product add. What I wanted to do is I wanted to add in this grouping that was called Glenn's favorite, and I'm going to make it dynamic. And then there were certain drinks that I really liked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a maxl command that is just going to use that product add rule and build it. And you'll notice that what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass to it, if I come back here to my bat file, I am going to pass to it the name of my shadow cube. So in this case, it's going to be that underscore in progress Kscope 21. And so if I run this process, let me get back to my, and this is why I pause this because now I can just run this next step. So what it's doing is it's logging on to Maxell with my encrypted ID and password. It's doing my process in background. While this is running, I can go ahead and I could retrieve data from the public cube and it will work just fine, even though this is doing a restructure and other things in the background. So users can get on it. In this case, it finished with no problems. And just to show you that it's true, so if I refresh this particular cube, I actually shouldn't see any change. This is the public cube. And you can see I still have 5 children of product. If I come back here to my in progress cube and look at the outline, and notice I now have 6 products. I now have Glenn's favorites, and I have the products underneath of them. So this did exactly what I wanted it to do, and the outline didn't update yet because I haven't done anything with the shadow. So I could go in here and I could retrieve data from this because I'm an administrator, or I could assign special security to some users to be able to do this and they'd be able to get into it. Otherwise, they just have access to the production cube. So now the third step of what we wanted to do is I have a choice here. I could just delete it, and you want to use the REST API call to delete it. I could come in here and just do a delete of the application, but when I do that, it doesn't take this cube out of that read-only mode. So you want to use the REST call if you're going to use the delete. I don't want to delete it. I think everything is just wonderful. So I'm going to promote the cube. And so my shadow cube promote, if we look at the promote right here, there's a couple of things that it needs to know. It needs to know the name of the shadow cube, and it needs to know the name of the application it's promoting it back to. I'm a little bit surprised at that. I thought it would actually know all of that. The amount of time to wait before unloading. So if users are in the middle of doing retrievals, do I want to wait for them to finish? And so I could, at this point in time, I've got it set to 0, but maybe I want to wait for 2 minutes just to give them time to finish what they're doing. And as soon as there is an open time before the next person does a retrieval, it will start kicking off this process. And again, do I want to run this in background or not? And it's very similar to my other thing. I'm going to invoke, the REST method, and I could do this in curl or I could do it other places. I just found that doing it in PowerShell gave me the ability to do more error checking. I couldn't figure out how to do it with a straight curl command, but this has, the try and catch built into it. So in this case, I'm going to promote the cube back. So if I come back over here to my batch window and I hit enter again, wish me luck. It's running that third PowerShell command. And here it is, it created job 381. And I'm doing this in the background so I get the jobs and so you can see all of this information. Otherwise, it won't create a job. It'll just pause here until it's done it. So now, if I come back here and I refresh my application list, in progress, Kscope 21 is gone, Kscope is back, and I can come in here. And now if I wanted to change February, and you'll notice I'm not relogging on, I'm just going to refresh. Oops, I didn't want to refresh, sorry. Live demos, what can I say? I want to submit the data. And now the data was submitted and you can see that product is reflected with the new amounts, all of that good stuff. And if I come in here You'll see for member selection, here's Glenn's favorites. So I could put that into my cube as well. Let's do it down here. Product, Glenn's favorites. And because this is a hybrid cube and it's dynamic, my numbers are coming out immediately. There you have it. I did my whole process very painlessly. Now I'm just going to finish my batch file and everything is done. So security remained on the cube. I didn't have any real downtime for the cube. Users could get at their data. And, you know, I have customers that have multi-hour long processes that, you know, interrupt their users during the day. What would you rather have? A 2-hour interruption where data is unavailable, or a 30-second interruption while the cube swap is happening? So I went through that fairly quickly and efficiently, I think. There are some, you know, if we look at the slides, I did have backup slides just in case that talks about what happens. But at this point in time, that's actually all you need to know about shadow cubes. Are there any questions that you have about shadow cubes? The process, what it can or can't do? Oh, by the way, shadow cubes can be used for a lot of different things. So for example, I mentioned, you know, during outline restructures, if you have long outline restructures for your whole batch process, if you wanted to do the batch process, you could also use it as part of a backup strategy. So you could create a shadow cube and then do an LCM on the backup cube, or even on the primary cube, because it's in a read-only mode and without interrupting your user. So you could create the shadow, do the backup on the shadow cube, and then when you're done, you could you know, put it back into a read-write mode. So there's a lot of things that you can do with shadow cubes. It's not just for the long-running batch processes. So I'll give you a minute or two in case you want to ask any questions. So Brian asks, if you want specific users to have access to the shadow cube, do you need to grant them the privileges every time you create the shadow cube? And the answer is yes, you do, but you can do it in your batch process. So for example, in here, I'm creating the shadow cube, and then I'm running this maxl to do my, you know, my update. But in here as well, I could also do the grants to grant the specific users access. So you don't have to do it manually. You know, I'm going to actually go ahead and run this again so I get the shadow cube back. So let's go this shadow cube.bat. Move that back here. So it created it. So if I come back here, so I mean, I could manually, I need to, that's one thing I wish it would keep that. So now I have this in progress cube. I mean, I could manually come in here and give permissions, but I can do it part of my batch process. So yes, it does have to be done every single time, because as I said, only the administrators are going to have access unless you explicitly give people, but it can be part of your process. Okay, we have some applications that take multiple minutes to copy because of the size of the cube. Does the process create the shadow run quicker than an application copy? And it actually does. They've optimized the backup process. Now, one of the things that I actually had asked for in this, if it were possible to create the shadow cube without any data in it, because some of my customers in their processing, the first thing that they do is they delete all of the data out of the cube and reload everything. But in this case, that was a harder ask, and they weren't able to provide that, at least in this initial release. But they did optimize the copy process, so it's a very, very fast copy. And so even on large cubes, on what we've tested, it's still been under a minute to do all of the copies. Your mileage may vary. You definitely will have to test it out on your system, but it does run quicker than an application copy. And so unless there are any other questions, that's all I have on shadow cubes. If you do have any questions about it that you get in the future, email me at gschwartzberg@interrel.com or info@interrel.com, and I'll be happy to get it for you. In addition, if you do want a copy of the batch scripts and the PowerShell scripts that I created, send me an email as well, and I'll send you a link to them. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, and have a great day.